the issues we're going to be talking about, so you know what your options are, what your flexibility is, and whatnot. I just got off a few minutes ago a call with one of the nation's largest nonprofits, a longtime client of mine, speaking about issues about their office reopenings and what they're going to do, and are they going to require vaccinations for people to come back to the office? They're having a board meeting in August that I'm actually going to be doing some board training for. Are they going to require their staff who are going to attend the board meeting to be vaccinated? Are they going to require that their board members be vaccinated as a precondition of attending? These are all kind of the issues that everyone's dealing with. And the announcement today from the CDC that vaccinated Americans are no longer required to wear masks indoors certainly changes the calculation as well, and I think is going to have an impact on decision making in this area. So, I will be talking about kind of the legal construct when it comes to both workplace reopenings, physical workplace reopenings, as well as meetings, events, conferences, things like that, and the various legal issues that come into play. Rebecca, who works for Seville's, and she can introduce herself in a second, is going to talk about things from a Seville's is a real estate broker, but they do a lot of other things as well in terms of advising employers on various workplace issues, and she's going to talk about that from her perspective. But we also want to hear from you guys in terms of what your thinking is, what you're planning to do. I think there's a lot of wait and see. Even the client I just talked to, the CEO was telling me that he's going to, they're really going to wait to see. In large part, they're based in DC. They want to see what the federal government is going to do. The federal government, which is the biggest employer in DC, often dictates a lot of what private employers do in terms of all of these different issues. And there's really been no decision yet or announcement from the federal government in terms of how they're going to deal with these issues. So there's still a lot of wait and see, but things are rapidly reopening. We work with about 350 nonprofit organizations. Many of them are already planning in-person meetings and gatherings and planning on reopening their offices in the second half of this year. And so these are really front and center issues that you have to be thinking about now. And hopefully I'll be able to shed some light on some of the legal construct here. As some of you know, I'm an attorney in DC in private practice. I've spent my whole 25-year career exclusively representing nonprofit organizations, primarily as outside general counsel, dealing with all the broad array of all of the different legal issues that nonprofits face. I'm the managing partner of Tenenbaum Law Group. We are a 3-lawyer boutique firm based in DC that focuses exclusively on representing nonprofits on their legal issues. And for most of my career, I was the chair of the nonprofit practice of the Venable Law Firm, a large national law firm based here in DC. Rebecca, why don't I turn it over to you to introduce yourself and your perspective, and then we'll open it up for questions. We don't have any prepared remarks or PowerPoint presentation or anything else, which hopefully will be welcome to you guys. We're going to answer your questions. We certainly have a lot of things that we know we're hearing, questions we're getting from our clients every day that we can certainly talk about, but we want this to be driven by you guys. So with that, Rebecca, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much. First, I'll say this is a real treat for me. I sit on a lot of these. I just got off a call with a law firm with like 15 people, and seeing like all the welcome comments in the chat is just such a pleasure and departure from a lot of the types of calls I sit on. So this is really great. My name is Rebecca Humphrey. I lead the workplace practice group for North America for Savills. As David and Jeff both said, we're a real estate consultancy firm. And so we have an arm of the company that does transactional brokerage services, but we have a fairly robust consultancy practice that works with all different size clients across all industries and regions, on different, consulting matters ranging from workplace strategy to project management and location strategy, labor analytics, et cetera. I've been in the industry for about 16 years. Every time I say that number, it grows. So I've been in the industry about 16 years. I've spent some of my background in project management and construction and design. My personal subject matter expertise is actually in change management and communications, is where I've spent a lot of my time. And I say this really to give you kind of some guardrails around the type of things we're consulting with clients on right now. We do a lot of work in the nonprofit sector. My group specifically, we have a team in DC that does a ton of business with nonprofits, a lot of whom right now we're helping with their return to office planning. And so from a size perspective, we deal really with very large clients, so, 10,000 heads, 3 million square feet, to much, much, much smaller than that, 30 people in an office. But we advise on all ends of the spectrum within that return planning, on the workplace strategy, how people are going to work, where they're going to sit, the hybrid model, what tools and technology you're going to need, the change management approach. We do a lot of policy work, bringing in outside legal counsel to work with us as we think about the policy ramifications and operational considerations. So hopefully between Jeff and I think we can answer any of your questions today, but thank you really very much for having me.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I've worked with Rebecca's colleague, Nicole Miller, who's a tenant side real estate broker that does a lot of work with nonprofit organizations. But this is actually the first time that Rebecca and I are speaking together. So with that, why don't we open it up to you guys to see what you guys want to hear about. Just start posing your questions to us, and we'll do everything we can to try to answer them. Who wants to get started?
Well, I have a question. I'm usually an outlier, so I figure I'll ask first. I don't have the problem of wanting people to come back and them not wanting to. I have the opposite issue. So I've got a couple situations. I have one person who wants to attend like one of these rural funder bus tours in a couple of weeks, and we're not back in person yet. And I'm trying to explain that that would provide inconsistency. So what I'd like to know is what kind of downside does that present for us in terms of liability? And then my other issue is, and how can we mitigate it? My other issue is we have funders who organize, under our umbrella. And I asked you this last time, who kind of go rogue sometimes, and trying to keep them all from starting to meet in person until we're ready as an organization to host events. Again, is there any downside, like liability, if that happens and we don't know about it? And does this staffer traveling like muddy the waters because we aren't complying with any system policy?
Great questions, Joanne. So first off, there's not really any legal concerns about starting your kind of reopening process gradually and not doing everything all at once. There's really no issue or problem there. In fact, that's what a lot of nonprofits are planning to do, kind of to start this gradually. So for instance, if you were to allow some staff to do some kind of work travel and others are not, I don't have any concerns about that. The real question is, and the question that I get all the time is, from a liability perspective, if you are requiring or permitting someone to come into the office and or to travel for work, and someone contracts the virus, when and how can your nonprofit organization be held liable for that? And the same thing goes, when it comes to not just for staff, but for attendees at your events. If you hold an in-person event and someone attends your event and they contract the virus, when and how can your nonprofit organization be held liable? So the short answer is, this is an area of law called negligence. It's a form of tort liability. Lawyers take torts in first-year law school, and the negligence is the most common form of tort liability. And what it basically means is that there's 5 elements to negligence. But basically what it means is that if you have a duty to a particular person, to an employee, to an attendee, which you generally do, you do owe a duty to, for instance, provide a reasonably safe, healthy workplace, conference, or event arrangements and things like that. You have a duty, but then the question is, did you or were you negligent in meeting the standard of care, the prevailing standard of care that exists at the time? That's really the threshold question. And that's really the only time that you're going to could be potentially held liable, is if you failed to meet the prevailing standard of care. So what is the standard of care? Well, first off, it's a legal standard, but you're never going to find it in one place. It's going to come from lots of different places. You always start by looking at what does the law mandate? So even right now, while things are rapidly changing, as we saw even today from the CDC announcement, there are very few federal mandates. There are some, like on airplanes and whatnot, but most of the mandates in terms of practices for workplaces, for conferences, things like that, they come from the state and local level. So you always start with the state and local laws, regulations, orders, things like that, to see what is mandated, right? In the last year, we had many state and local mandates that prohibited large gatherings, right? That mandated mask wearing indoors, that mandated social distancing, that mandated certain sanitation and ventilation requirements and things like that. And a lot of those still exist. They're rapidly changing, but you start by looking at those to see what is in place. And it's going to be based on the geography. Wherever your event is being held, wherever your workplace is, if you have people in different states, remote work or whatnot, or offices in different states, it's always going to be driven by the state and local ordinances, requirements, regulations, et cetera. So you start there, but it doesn't end there. The next place we typically look to define what is that standard of care is federal guidance, particularly from agencies like the CDC, like OSHA, with respect to workplaces. So you look there, and actually both the CDC has guidance in place. It's likely going to be amended very soon, but they have guidance in place for large meetings and certain standards that they recommend for how large meetings have to be conducted. And that guidance has not been updated recently, so I strongly suspect it will be. But you look to that, even though it's advisory in nature, it's not mandatory, it does help to inform what is the standard of care. For workplaces, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, a federal agency, has guidance already with respect to workplaces in COVID and what you need to do in terms of ventilation and sanitation and social distancing and all that. Again, that is likely going to be amended as well. But you look to those things and you basically try to do as many of those things as you can. The more, and when I say can, because some things are just not practical or too expensive or they're too burdensome. But the more of those things you can do, the harder it's going to be for someone to prove that you were negligent. And even today, after the CDC guidance about vaccinated Americans don't have to wear masks indoors, that's very relevant because now if you do not impose a mask wearing requirement for those who are vaccinated indoors, it's going to be virtually impossible for someone to say that alone caused you to be negligent in how you opened your workplace or how you ran your events or things like that. So you look to those things, you try to do as many of those things as possible. And then when you're talking about, there's always other parties involved, right? You guys don't control everything. As the employer, as a sponsor of an event, you have hotels and convention centers and meeting venues that are hosting things. You have a landlord, unless you own your building, and you have a landlord that owns your building, and only the landlord is going to pretty much be able to do things like change ventilation systems and sanitation requirements and things like that, cleaning of the offices. And so what you want to do is you want to try to push onto those other parties as many of these obligations as possible, get them to agree that they're going to do X, Y, Z, again, based on whatever that prevailing standard of care is. Contractually, even just in email exchanges, whatever you can do to get those other parties to do their part to create a safe and healthy, whether it's a workplace, event environment, conference meeting, whatever the case may be. And if you do those things, it's going to be very, very difficult for someone to hold you liable. The same thing goes, Joanne, with your question about staff travel. There's common sense guidance that you can give to your employees, even mandate for your employees when they're on staff travel. And if you mandate those sorts of things, then if they veer off path and kind of don't obey the ground rules, that's on them. And if they end up contracting the virus and were able to cause it, that they contracted it because of something like that, theoretically, causation is always very difficult when it comes to COVID. But even in that situation, if you do those things and they veer off course, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to hold you liable. I see there's a question here, and I get it every day, and that's the question of, can we mandate vaccinations as a condition of employees returning to the office, as a condition of going on work travel for employees, as a condition of employees attending your own events, staffing your events, board meetings, things like that? And then separately, can we require our event attendees, whether it's board meetings, conference attendees, whatever else the case may be, to require proof of vaccination as a condition of attendance? So Let me start out. The legal construct is different when it comes to employees versus like event and conference attendees and board members, because employees have a lot of protections built in federal and state law, federal, state, and local law. Like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, for instance, applies to employees. It does not apply to event and meeting and conference attendees, or even board members attending a board meeting. And so for employees, the short answer, and it's very clear, even with the current emergency use authorization that exists for the vaccines, as opposed to a permanent FDA approval, or full FDA approval, I should say. Even in that situation, because of the significant risk that COVID poses, it is permissible for employers to require vaccinations as a condition of coming back to the workplace, and or as a condition of going on work travel or going to work events or things like that. There's absolutely no problem in doing that, so long as you make two exceptions. One is for anyone that has a medical condition that would prohibit them or make it too risky for them to get the vaccine. And that's because of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the various state parallel laws, statutes that exist in that area, that if someone has a medical condition, you are obligated to make a reasonable accommodation for that person, so long as with that reasonable accommodation, they can still perform the essential functions of the job. And so long as that accommodation does not pose an undue burden on your organization as an employer. So so that's one of the exceptions you have to make. And you can, by the way, you can ask this. I mean, the ADA has been around for 25 years. There's a lot of precedent in this area, and it's clear you are allowed to ask people what their medical condition is that prohibits them from getting vaccinated, because you need to know that information in order to know what sort of reasonable accommodation is going to work. Remote work versus, you might say you can come into the office, but you have to wear a mask and you have to socially distance from everyone if you're not vaccinated, whereas vaccinated employees don't have to do any of those things. You can absolutely do that. So that's one exception. The other exception is for a sincerely held religious belief. So if someone has a sincerely held religious belief, this is due to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, that would prohibit them from getting vaccinated. You have to, it's that same basic standard. It's actually a little bit looser standard, but the same basic standard of making a reasonable accommodation as long as they can still perform the essential functions of the job, and as long as it doesn't pose an undue burden. And that part about performing the essential functions of the job, if someone's job requires them to do certain things in person, and there really is no reasonable accommodation you could make. I'm not saying that that's going to be the case, but if theoretically that were the case, then you can actually say, sorry, you can't work for us anymore, because there is no reasonable accommodation we can make that would allow you to perform the essential functions of the job. The undue burden test is really a financial test usually. Would it be too expensive for the organization? And that's a much higher standard. So those are the two exceptions you have to make for employees. In terms of non-employees, board members, conference attendees, event attendees, things like that, same basic situation. You can require vaccinations if you want. You can make that mandatory. The one exception there, the religious, sincerely held religious belief doesn't apply. And by the way, sincerely held religious belief does not mean sincerely held political belief. It's a religious belief only. But in the for non-employees, the only exception is Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which does impose that same requirement to provide a reasonable accommodation when someone has a medical condition or other disability that would prohibit them from getting vaccinated. So in short, you have a lot of leeway to impose vaccinations as a condition of coming back to work and traveling for work and attending events and things like that. Now, the political issue of whether you want to do that, is a much different calculation, and nonprofits are really struggling with that. And that struggle is going to get even harder after today with the CDC announcement. But it's, that's has all, it's an employee morale issue, a political issue, some of the other considerations there. But that's the basic lay of the land. I didn't catch all of the questions that have been posed. And maybe Dave, as we get through this, you can kind of pose some of those. Get into it. But there was one about liability waivers.
Yeah.
It's separate and apart from, this issue of mandatory vaccinations. In short, you cannot require liability waivers for employees because all or virtually all the states under the workers' compensation statutes they make it illegal for an employee to waive its rights to workers' compensation. And workers' compensation is the primary vehicle through which an employee claimed that they contracted the virus at the workplace or whatnot, it would have to go through. For meeting, event, conference attendees, it's absolutely fine. There's no problem doing so. I strongly recommend it. You know, a liability waiver meaning I attendee recognize that there's some risk from attending this event. I understand COVID's a dangerous virus, et cetera. If I contract the virus at your event, I agree to not hold the organization liable. That's absolutely fine. It's not an end all be all silver bullet. You know, liability waivers get tossed out by courts all the time for different reasons, but a lot of times they don't. And I see only upside and no downside to requiring that. You want to have them affirmatively, click and accept something online where as a condition of attendance, they agree to that liability waiver. And then last thing on that, we recommend that you couple that liability waiver with a kind of an affirmation of conduct that the attendees agree to abide by your rules, basically, whatever rules you might be imposing at your event that are COVID related, that they agree to abide by those. So long answer to a few questions, but hopefully that was helpful.
And I'll just add in, because it's such a tricky question to get around some of the ways we're seeing people be non-committal to that right now are coming out with, communication or policies with things like, we strongly encourage or we strongly recommend you get vaccinations, or we strongly encourage you to come back to the office. Some of the places we're seeing, we're not seeing any client say you're required to get vaccinated, plus you're required to be in 5 days a week. Instead, we're seeing things like, we're encouraging you to come back to the office. If you're going to come back, we require you to be vaccinated, but if you don't feel comfortable, you don't have to come back. We're seeing a lot of built-in flexibility because they don't want to necessarily come out right now with that mandate, so to speak, because it's a little bit of a tricky issue. I would say the other thing we're seeing a lot of time spent on, and with consulting with people like Jeff, is the way those exceptions get tracked. From an HR perspective and on the client end. So, rather than just having people, walking into your office or emailing their medical conditions and all of that happening between HIPAA, privacy protected class and things like that, we're seeing a lot of time spent on making sure that you have the right advice coming in as far as how you're, going to track those exceptions, and making sure that if there are going to be exceptions made for whatever reasons to a mandate or a policy put out, that you're consulting with outside counsel to make sure you're doing it in the correct manner.
Yeah, let me address a few of the questions that were posed here. Someone asked about the applicability of the ADA. I believe the ADA applies to employers with 25 or more employees. However, like in DC where I'm at, there's a DC version of the ADA that applies to all employers. So you always have to look to the state equivalent. But you're right, the ADA typically only applies, I believe it only applies to 25 or more employees. Someone asked, under what conditions could you require people to come back to the office? We have a lot of people who use public transportation, and I could see some of them not wanting to come to the office. Bottom line is that if you want to mandate that people have to come back to the office when you reopen, with or without vaccinations, that's again a separate issue and a separate analysis. But if that is your policy, that your remote work policy, a lot of, as Rebecca well knows, a lot of employers are reevaluating the remote work policy because people got so used to and enjoyed working remotely that a lot of them are looking at changing their remote work policies permanently. But that doesn't mean allowing anyone to work from home anytime they want. A lot of employers, and I've talked to a lot of CEOs who just don't want to do that. They don't feel like they've gotten the most out of their employees over the last year. And they want to require them to be back in the office at least a certain portion of the time. And again, so long as you make those two exceptions that I talked about, for a medical condition or a sincerely held religious belief, yes, you can require them to come back. And if they choose not to, you can terminate them. Now, granted, I wouldn't recommend doing that until we're at a place where public transportation in your particular city, is fully back online and fully operational and things like that. And schools are fully open in terms of childcare issues and whatnot. From an Potentially from a liability perspective, but more from an employee relations perspective, you really don't want to do that. But it's probably not going to be too long when all of that is back up and running. And then you absolutely can require that. And if someone doesn't fall into one of those two exceptions, and most employees don't, then you can say, we're going to have to let you go. That is absolutely permissible.
On the transportation front, one of the things we've been doing recently, I mean, we're doing this in our own company. We just announced a date in July of coming back, and we have, I'm managing that for our company, and some people are happy and there are some people who are not, and they're not excited about it. They're fearful and frustrated and scared. And in our more urban areas regarding public transportation, one of the ideas we had was for one particular employee, we set up a system where we picked one day, like 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, and we had them come in during non-peak times to see what their comfort level was with taking public transportation, not having them come in when there was a lot of people. And if they felt really uncomfortable during that, then we would kind of try and figure out what the best path forward is. We're trying, a lot of companies are trying to work where they can on a, not hand holding people, but kind of phasing and tiptoeing them back to that threshold of coming back. Exactly like Jeff said, you can ask your employees to come back whenever you want. It's all a matter of the employee reaction and perception, how that's going to impact morale, and what you're willing to have as far as trade-offs or pain points of getting to that point, essentially. From an employee psyche perspective, it's the two things we're advising clients on right now where it's becoming difficult for a lot of companies. One, it's not an easy thing to ask people to shift this protected mindset that they're in of guarding themselves and protecting themselves, and this ingrained behavior you've trained yourself on for the last year and a half, and then just expect fill up a light switch and be okay with things. That's a really hard transition for a lot of people to make. If you're the decision maker, you've probably been sitting with the concept of people coming back for a while, so it's maybe not as big a jump for you, but for other people it is. So wherever you can build in runway time to allow people to get used to that idea, to work with them, and to softly or slowly get them back into the office, that ends up being a more successful process where you can do that. The other thing that we're seeing, or where we're trying to help build some communications, is inevitably we're going to come to a point, maybe it's sooner, maybe it's a year from now, I don't know when it will be, but we're going to come to a point where we treat COVID like we treat the flu. And there aren't going to be as extreme exceptions made. We're not going to be wearing masks anymore. We're not going to be, social distancing. And so getting people to transition up to that point so that when that happens, again, it's not as much of a shock to their system, is another reason just where there's the ability to build your timeline out with that runway, get people to that point so that it's an easier transition for them.
That's a great comment, and I'm seeing that from a number of our clients. Let me respond to a few of these quick questions. First, thanks, Judy, for posting the information about the applicability of the ADA, which applies in the title that relates to employment applies to 15 or more employees. I was misremembering. And she also included information about the other kind of civil rights protections and the size of employers, a number of employees, the size of the employer to which those provisions apply. That's very helpful. Someone asked, can you give a real world example of a sincerely held religious belief that would pass muster to allow someone to refuse to come back to work in this case? So remember that what I was talking about was the vaccination requirement, that if someone has a sincerely held religious belief that does not permit them to be vaccinated, the EEOC has said that is something that is valid and you have to honor that. That does not necessarily relate to a requirement to come back to the office. So if you don't have a mandatory vaccination requirement, but you tell you say to everyone, we're reopened for business, as after Labor Day, whatever the date is, and if you want to keep working here, you have to come back into the office. If someone has a sincerely held religious belief that says, well, I'm not allowed to get vaccinated under my religion, that is not going to come into play in that decision, because you're not requiring vaccinations. That's a choice that they are making. I just had a conversation with an employment lawyer this week about this. And you are absolutely permitted to say, if you don't come back to the office, then you don't have a job. Again, Rebecca's giving great advice about easing employees into these situations, but completely permissible. Can an employer require employees to sign an affirmation of conduct as it relates to attending conferences and meetings, absolutely. That's very different from a liability waiver. That's just saying I agree to abide by the following rules or whatever rules you might have. There's absolutely no issue or problem there.
I know, Kyle, you had a question about misalignment of state and federal laws. Do you want to ask it? I've lost it now.
Yeah, just quickly, thanks, David. If it's not applicable, let me know. But we're seeing a lot of state bills get introduced that bar wearing mandatory mask wearing, mandatory vaccines.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering where the state and federal laws conflict. As an employer, which way do you have to go to preserve your rights and liabilities and so forth?
So it's always going to be a lowest common denominator in terms of, like, right now, there are some federal mask mandates, like on airplanes, for instance. But there are no, federal mask mandates when it comes to offices or even restaurants or things like, or hotels or things like that. It's all at the state and local level. So if a state or city or county requires it, you obviously have to do it. If a city, and we are seeing, as you know, some states like Florida and elsewhere, passing laws making it illegal, for, say, an employer or a hotel or something to have a mandatory mask requirement, that is going to trump, any federal guidance, even though the CDC says that they don't believe that it's medically necessary to wear a mask indoors if you're vaccinated. If you have a state law or a city or county law that says the opposite, that's going to apply, and that's going to trump, any federal guidance in that regard.
Can you talk about when liability waivers come into play or are even legally useful?
I think I already did.
Did you talk about that already? Okay.
I think I covered that. I don't really want to. I'll repeat it if you.
No,
I was asking. I heard you talk about the affirmation of conduct. I mean, how is that legally useful? And can you just make it up, or is there an actual legal?
No, so it's not. It's not as legally useful as the liability waiver, for conference attendees, for instance, but it's still relevant because it helps to establish that you are not being negligent in how you're conducting your meeting. If you are requiring, attendees, whether it's to require them to be vaccinated, requiring them to wear a mask, or requiring them or prohibiting them from going off site to, risky, dangerous situations, loud, crowded, or, packed, crowded bars at night or things like that. It's just more evidence to show that you are not being negligent in how you operated that meeting. So it does help legally. It also helps to remind people that you have certain rules and you're going to expect people to abide by those. Of course, you also need to make sure, like Kyle just said, that those rules are consistent with whatever applicable, state and local laws and regulations might be in place.
Yeah, and I just, because of a lot of the things or questions here, I want to just, I guess, from my vantage point of, I speak with a lot of different companies all over the country, industries and spectrum. First and foremost, this is a hard question for all of them. Like, regardless of the resources a company has, regardless of the size of them, this is an incredibly challenging time and path for, specifically, I think, for decision makers, CEOs, key business leaders to make. Because you're kind of walking this tightrope of, you need to understand exactly, as Jeff is outlining, the guardrails of liability and risk and what you need to do with wanting to make sure that you're keeping safety, employee safety at the forefront of your mind, but also wanting employee morale to be high. You want people to want to come back and you want people engaged. And so finding the right path between those two, I think sometimes I probably come across as almost having a cop-out answer to people, but it is very specific to your organization and your culture and what that path is for you. It's not, while one company, one nonprofit, one organization might say, we need to mandate and this job can't be done without it, somebody, equal size across the street from them, that might not work for them. So it really is very specific to what could or could not work for you. It's important to just understand, as Jeff has outlined, what the guardrails around that are, and then trying to figure out what that path forward is.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to a client yesterday and they were telling me that they're actually getting a lot of pressure from a lot of their staff to mandate vaccinations. that they want, they want to be able to come back and feel safe in the office, and they are putting pressure on the CEO and the HR folks to mandate vaccination. So that's going to be an interesting.
I just had a meeting on Tuesday. I met with all the admins in our company and our operations group. So that was, I'm going to say it was about 100 plus people. And that was probably the prevailing sentiment, was asking how we're going to protect the people who do want to come back to require vaccinations. And what if it's a state where people aren't wearing masks and it's not mandated, but we want to have masks to feel comfortable.
Yeah, Rebecca, so I know you're going to have some insight into this. So in terms of, and there was a question about this as well, in terms of kind of remote work policies generally, kind of post-COVID, are you starting to see any trends yet, particularly in the nonprofit space? We know that I've seen and heard it a lot, that a lot of employees are asking for more flexible remote work. I mean, some people are asking if they can just remote work completely. Some want to have a little more flexibility. As we all know, there are lots of, most of us, even my own law firm, we've made it work over the last year, but there are a lot of implications, costs, legal issues that come into play because wherever the employee is principally located, that triggers those states' laws, everything from unemployment compensation, to applicable employment laws, to insurance issues, to tax issues, business licenses, other things like that. And especially if you're a national organization or you have employees all over the place in different states, it can be a pretty big burden. And plus, a lot of employers, a lot of senior management don't want to, they made it work over the last year, but they don't want necessarily to have this completely remote workforce. And so what sort of trends? I know someone asked about best practices. I'm guessing it's way too soon to start to draw best practices out when it comes to that. But give us a sense as to what you're seeing and advising your clients
on. Excellent question. I mean, so first I'll say it's a really complicated question. I think people throw out the term hybrid workforce or remote work like as a very generalized term, but there is a lot of intricacy and nuance to how the mechanism and the construct of how that actually gets built out and then supported and sustained in an organization. I would say I haven't seen really anybody we're working with. I've seen no one go to either opposite extreme. I've had no one say like everyone is 100% remote. And I've had no one say everyone is 100% 5 days in the office. I would say pretty much everyone we're working with and that we speak with is somewhere in the between in that kind of, and there's some people on this end of the spectrum where it's more in the office with some flexibility and some on the opposite end. As far as policies, I think we've been kind of seeing a lot of people trying to skirt around that, which we're not recommending, saying like, well, do we even really need a remote work policy if we're going to have a hybrid workforce? Like, can we just not have a policy? Which from everything we've been told and directed is not necessarily the best direction to head in, to not have any type of a policy written down and just kind of pretend it doesn't exist. What we're seeing as far as the different strategies people are taking on for remote work or that hybrid workforce, we're seeing a couple of different approaches, and this really depends on your organization and what kind of the right fit for you is. We're seeing some approach it from a kind of a group or department or team perspective, where they're saying this team can be a remote team forever. This team is a team that needs some time in the office, some time at home, but this team really needs to be in the office to be functional. And they're kind of doing it on a department or group or based on functionality. Typically, you're speaking with the head of that group to really make sure that's the right fit for them. Sometimes some organizations will take it another step and they're surveying the actual employees themselves to hear what the employee feedback is on that. But that's one way we're seeing organizations tackle it. Another way we're seeing is giving wholesale flexibility to pretty much the whole organization, and where you say, hey, we're having a flexible model. The office is here. We're not going to assign seats, or we're going to assign neighborhood seating instead, where let's say you have a team of 10 and you allocate 5 seats to them, and they can figure out how they want to use those 5 seats. And so they're really giving whole scale flexibility and saying, here's a schedule, a room booking software, a seat booking software, pre-book your desk on the days you want to go in, you can make your own judgment on days you do or don't want to be in the office based on your own schedule. So that's a second scenario we're seeing. The third, which I would say is, I don't know if it's more frequent, but we certainly see this happening or being seriously considered, is having kind of a bridge between the two, where you're not super structured and you're not saying this group is forever at home, this group is forever in the office, but you're also not saying you can do whatever you want. That's operationally a hard thing to manage if you just say do whatever. Like, think about like picking floor captains in your like business continuity and your life and safety protocols for your office space and things like that. Having whole scale flexibility and not knowing who's going to be on the office any given day can sometimes be a little hard to manage from an operational and facilities perspective. And so what we're seeing in other instances is really a more structured way where there's, one team that may come in Monday, Tuesdays, another team that comes in Thursdays, Fridays. You have some type of hoteling or seat sharing model in there. And so that's a third approach we're seeing as far as how people are thinking kind of about that hybrid model. There's definitely no benchmarking yet. There's not a ton of lessons learned because we have a lot of people who are just waiting to see. They're studying all this now and they're looking at their options, but a lot are not like coming down with their decisions. I would say very few of our clients have made like firm final decisions of like, this is what they're doing. But based on all of the changes coming in from the CDC and vaccinations increasing in their rollout, I think we're getting a lot closer and people are feeling the pressure to kind of make that decision and to move forward with some plan. But pretty much everyone is considering some path to hybrid. The amount or degree of flexibility really varies based on what that company does for a business and, from a pure work profile perspective, what they think they need to be able to move their business forward, essentially.
That's great. That's really helpful. The only thing I'll add from a legal perspective is that, employers have great flexibility in how they structure their remote work policies. There's no exceptions there to the various employment laws that protect individual employees from discrimination and other things like that. And in the past, pre-COVID, having kind of inconsistent or subjective allowances for some people to work remotely and some not have been the basis of claims filed by employees, claims, state employment agencies, lawsuits and whatnot, claiming that someone was discriminated against, for instance, because of some protected characteristic. They were not allowed to work remotely, but someone else was. And those issues are still going to exist, which is why, from a legal perspective, it is really important to have a remote work policy, whatever your policy is. And, for larger employers, like Rebecca said, if you have some good reason why some, departments are able to work more remotely and some are not, as long as there's a legitimate basis for that, that's going to be okay. But the key is you want to have objective policies and you want to apply them consistently. However you draft them, and it's going to be very important to do that. So many employment claims, and you may be saying as an employer, as a CEO, but I'm not letting that person work remotely because of their, XYZ protected characteristic. I'm not letting them work remotely because it's not suitable for the job, or they've shown a history of not being able to be successful when they're not in the office and they need supervision. But the bottom line is it doesn't stop people from bringing a claim and alleging that it's because of one or more of the protected characteristics. So you always have to guard against that.
So, say, Jeff, you had mentioned this question for you or Rebecca. You mentioned that some of your clients you see starting to move back to some in-person meetings or bigger gatherings. Have you seen any? Might be too early, but are you seeing any trends around putting in place certain safety practices, even if they aren't required? Or like, are they thinking about we're still going to make people social distance or wear masks, or is it too soon to make them comfortable coming, even if they don't have to do that?
It's not. We are seeing that. There have been meetings, by the way, smaller ones, but there have been nonprofit meetings throughout the pandemic. I actually attended and spoke at a conference last October in Savannah, Georgia, And the organization did a terrific job with all the COVID protocols, and no one got sick. And it was a really successful conference with all of the things that we're all very familiar with right now. I think the biggest question going forward and the biggest variable is going to be whether you mandate vaccinations as a precondition of attending the events. Because if you do, then I think you have a lot more flexibility from a liability perspective, and just to help everyone feel that it's a safe and healthy environment, to allow more conduct that might otherwise be problematic. If you don't require vaccinations, then from potentially from a legal perspective and certainly from a political perspective, you may need to do certain things to make people feel more comfortable. And while the CDC guidance today is saying for vaccinated folks, don't have to wear masks indoors, if you're not requiring vaccinations, then that doesn't matter. And some might say, even from a liability perspective, if you want to be safe, if you're not going to require vaccinations, then you should require mask wearing indoors for everyone, because you have no way of knowing who's vaccinated and who's not, along with all the other protocols of social distancing and spacing and whatnot. And just because, for instance, you might be in a state like Florida, not to pick on Florida, but they've been very aggressive throughout the pandemic and not kind of restricting almost any sorts of gatherings. The only restrictions that have really applied have been occupancy restrictions on, you can't have more than 50% occupancy of a hotel ballroom and things like that. But even if the state or a city allows large gatherings without social distancing, as is quickly becoming a trend, it doesn't mean that you should not impose those things, at least for now, if you're not going to mandate vaccinations. Whereas if you do mandate vaccinations, and generally speaking, I think all the social distancing and mask wearing requirements go out the window, and you really don't have to do that from a liability perspective. So it's going to be, I'm really interested to see how a lot of conferences react to this. That same conference I spoke at in October, the next one is in June in Tennessee that I'm also speaking at, and that'll be the first conference that I will be attending this year. And I'm especially now with vaccinations, I don't believe they're requiring vaccinations as a precondition of attendance, but I am interested to see what sort of protocols that they put in place.
Thanks. What do we ask for proof of vaccination?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and the answer is different if you're in New York versus anywhere else. Because in New York they have this, this vaccine passport that, frankly, there's a lot of pressure on the federal government to kind of approve other kind of, vaccine passports, on your phone and whatnot, apps to be able to show that. Oh yeah, someone just mentioned, by the way, yeah, if you're in a state that prohibits mandatory vaccinations for passports, and that's a different issue, and obviously that's very much going to come into play. But right now, for those of us who are vaccinated and are not in New York, all we have is that little card that we get, the printed card, and presumably you would just show the actual card or a picture of the card and then show your ID to show that it matches up to you. That's about the best we can do right now. I suspect that as more and more, a lot of big event venues, sporting venues and others have already said they're going to mandate vaccinations as a condition of attendance. I think there'll be more pressure, on app developers and some sort of federal standards for privacy and data security and things like that to facilitate that. But right now, it largely doesn't exist outside of New York.
Jeff, I want to ask a clarifier. Like Joanne's an outlier in one direction, I'm probably an outlier in the other. And so one of my board members is very concerned about documentation regarding vaccinations, specifically maybe with HIPAA. Like, as employers, do we have any concerns, or are we can we take the word of employees that they've been vaccinated? Because that's how we've been operating. Or do we need a document to see their card? And if so, do we retain it?
Yeah, the answer to that is easy. The EEOC has said there are no HIPAA issues with requiring proof of vaccination. Now, if you were to ask, more detailed medical questions beyond that, that's a different story. But if you're just requiring to show them your vaccination card, that is absolutely permissible, and that does not trigger HIPAA. Now, I saw someone said that they're gonna, have people self-attest, and that's up to you. Again, you're not mandated to require vaccinations. If you want to, but you want to go through a self, someone's just going to self-attest that they're vaccinated, and you're going to take their word for it, that's certainly permissible as well. Now, if I were to, an enterprising plaintiff's lawyer, might say, well, proof is available, you weren't asking for it, therefore you were negligent, because, again, this would be if someone contracted the virus and they could prove that they contracted it at your event, and they might use that as evidence that you were negligent. I don't know how strong that argument would be, but something to keep in
mind. Probably the last question, someone asked, have you seen any clients be concerned about people being potentially stigmatized who choose not to be vaccinated for, I guess, whatever reason? Or is that?
Rebecca, why don't I've been monopolizing the conversation. Do you want to take a stab?
I spend a lot of my day talking, so no worries. I think it is a real concern. I don't know that we're seeing it happen whole scale yet, because not many people or they're just starting to get back full time, but I think it's certainly a concern. I know we just spoke about it for our own return planning the other day. Somebody asked us, well, can I as an employee ask somebody else if they got vaccinated? Am I allowed to ask somebody else that? And because we're not mandating vaccines in our organization right now, we're just strongly recommending, we don't think other employees should be going around saying to somebody else, "Did you get vaccinated?" But eventually they're saying word will get around and someone will get stigmatized. So I think it certainly is a concern. I think there are a lot of concerns around who does it, who doesn't. You have concerns, somebody sneezes sitting at their desk and you have 5 people who are sitting around them and who get freaked out. Like, what do you do in that type of scenario, right? So working, I think, in conjunction with folks like Jeff to make sure from a legal perspective you're getting advised, but also making sure you have HR looped in and everybody who needs to be a key stakeholder to decide how you want to move forward. I don't know that I have a great answer on what to do in those scenarios. I think we're all trying to figure that out right now and figure out what the best solution is. But certainly from a change management perspective, I think that is a friction point that we're anticipating happening and needing to figure out what the right path forward is.
Yeah, and Dave, I think that this group and this organization, your organization, is a great vehicle for trying to do some pressure testing and benchmarking, and how are your organizations dealing with all of these different issues, and doing some sort of surveying on even maybe on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, because I've found this my whole career. Nonprofits, they like to do what their peers are doing. They don't like to get too far ahead of it. And their employees know what the peers are doing as well. And so knowing how others are dealing with all of these tricky issues, you have a terrific group to be able to ask, in a confidential manner, and share aggregated results and whatnot with people. I think that's a great way for everyone to kind of move, kind of progress in a way that they feel comfortable doing. I saw someone comment that, maybe the federal government is moving faster than a lot of nonprofits. And yeah, that announcement today caught, I think, everyone by surprise. And it doesn't mean that, you have to go along with that. It doesn't mean that you can't require masks, again, unless you're in a state or something that prohibits some sort of mask mandate, or private organizations imposing a mask requirement. But anyway, I think it's a terrific group to be able to benchmark against your peers.
Right, yes, it is a terrific group in general. And we will definitely, to answer some questions that were in the chat, the forum will definitely work to consolidate information on our website, provide a way for you to share examples of different things you're creating or doing, and we'll work the step up to be a vehicle for that, gathering of documents and information and links. And I'll work with Rebecca and Jeff too to gather things that they know are already out there. And happy to do some quick and dirty, some surveying too of you all. We've done a little of that, and happy to continue to do that too, so we can see what everyone else is doing. So that'll be coming too. And with that, can you all just join me in a virtual thank you to Rebecca and Jeff for this great informative time together. This was recorded, so we'll be sharing that back out with you in case you want to share with any other folks on your team. I wish you all a great rest of the week. Yes.
If I could say one thing, for those of you who are interested, Rebecca and I, along with two other folks, an HR and another real estate professional, are going to be doing a complimentary 1-hour video webinar on June 22nd on these topics. Some of the same issues we already talked about, but because we have other participants as well, we'll get into some other aspects of this as well. I'll send, once that's posted, it should be any day now, I'll send the link to Dave if you want to share it with you guys, but you might be interested in that.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Absolutely, we'll share that. And just one final reminder, July 15th, our virtual CEO Summit. The link's on our website. Hope you'll sign up for that. And look forward to seeing you all online again soon. So take care, you all. Nice seeing you all today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.